One frequent topic of discussion amongst the gaming community in recent years is the perceived decline of Xbox, following years of no exclusives, a heavy focus on the Game Pass subscription service over making new content, and Microsoft's behavior on buying up studios for ridiculous amounts of money, only to then lay them off when they don't actually have the funds to keep them going. With their recent behavior of porting their titles over to PC and competing platforms like PlayStation 5 and Nintendo Switch, leading to speculation and fears of them potentially transitioning into a third-party publisher and abandoning the console market entirely. How far you subscribe to this theory, and in general how doomed Xbox as a brand is, varies from person to person. However, one thing everyone can seemingly agree on is that all these problems and the negative perception the brand has can all be linked back to one major event: the reveal and launch of the Xbox One, where Microsoft seemingly did everything in their power to not show or discuss any new games for the system, and instead showed how great it was for watching TV and movies, all the while providing a laundry list of reasons why you shouldn't buy one and get a PS4 instead. Whilst this scenario may be shocking to look at, both in terms of how badly they screwed up and where they are now as a result, at the very least, Microsoft can take comfort with the fact that, at least from what we can tell, the Xbox One, whilst being far from perfect, is not the worst launch a system has ever had. In fact, there are ones where it not only undeniably left a worse impact, but arguably were directly responsible for killing the company involved with its creation. I hope you've strapped yourselves in, as I'm about to give you just a small showcase of what are some of the worst console launches of all time. When people think of Sega's failures, one of the first things that tends to come up is the downfall of the Dreamcast, the company's all-or-nothing bet to try and stay in the console market that came crashing down mostly due to a mix of lack of third-party support as well as its struggles to compete with the PlayStation 2. However, one of the bigger reasons for its eventual failure wasn't so much the system itself, and more so the shitstorm that brewed as a result of what came before it with Sega's previous console, the Saturn. For anyone unfamiliar of where Sega was at this point in time, this was following the Mega Drive, which, whilst not really making an impact in Japan, losing to both the Super Nintendo and NEC's PC engine, it did see a lot of success in Europe and America, following a successful marketing campaign and the popularity of their then brand new mascot, Sonic the Hedgehog. In addition, they were also doing well in the arcades, particularly with their big push into 3D games with the Sega Model 1 board, which was used for titles such as Virtua Racing and Virtua Fighter. So naturally, based on this, it made sense that they'd want to make a new console to capitalize on this, which they did, though apparently out of fear of potentially ostracizing developers who only knew how to make sprite-based games, it was decided to base its hardware on their previous arcade board, the System 32, which was used for games like Radmobile, Golden Axe: The Revenge of Death Adder, and 1994's Jurassic Park Arcade. Now, to be fully honest, the exact details of what happened with the making of the Sega Saturn isn't too important. In fact, the system's initial launch in Japan on the 22nd of November 1994 isn't what we're interested in either, as despite the console's legacy in general gaming circles, it actually did fairly well over there, with its initial shipment of 200,000 units apparently selling out after the first day. And when the restock came in on the 3rd of December, the same day Sony launched the original PlayStation, the Saturn was still managing to sell more units. And whilst, yes, by the end of the generation, the PS1 would come out the victor by quite a large margin, within Japan, the Saturn was still able to outsell the Nintendo 64. Instead, we're specifically interested in how Sega handled the international launch. Things were fairly normal at first, first, with Tom Kalinske, the then CEO of Sega of America, announcing the Saturn's US launch date of the 2nd of September 1995, officially referring to the date as Saturn Day. However, after Sony started to gain traction over the first few months of 95, Sega of Japan demanded the release date be pushed forward in order to give an advantage by releasing months before the PS1's US release date of the 9th of September that same year. So, during the first ever E3 event on the 11th of May 1995, Kalinske would hold a presentation where they announced the system's $399 price tag, general features of the system, and then claimed that due to an apparent high demand for the system, they decided to instead launch it on the 11th of May 1995. Which, if you were paying attention, you'd notice that was the same day he was giving that presentation. No, you did not mishear that. In an attempt to get a one-up on Sony, Sega shadow dropped the Saturn's US release without telling anyone. Kalinske confirming they had already shipped off 30,000 units to Toys R Us, Babbage's, aka GameStop, Electronics Boutique, aka EB Games, and Software etc. for an immediate release. This move did not help the Saturn, and instead, it did the exact opposite. Retailers who weren't informed about it and included in the system's early launch were furious at the announcement, with KB Toys specifically being so mad they chose to blacklist the system entirely. On top of that, thanks to the rushed release date, only 6 games were actually available at launch, and due to the fact that third-party developers and publishers weren't told about the release date change, most of the other releases wouldn't be ready until the originally planned date in September, rendering any advantage they would have gained from releasing 4 months early completely null and void, and alienating most third parties from wanting to continue working with them. Even the announcement itself didn't help Sega, as the only thing the press and attendees were talking about that day was when during Sony's presentation after Sega, Sony Computer Entertainment America's president, Steve Race, walked up to the microphone, stated $299, and then walked off to thunderous applause from everyone in attendance simply by virtue of the PS1 being $100 cheaper than the Saturn. If things couldn't be bad enough from completely cocking up the US release, Sega proceeded to do the exact same thing in Europe, where the system released ahead of schedule on the 8th of July 1995, which ended up leaving both stores and the press with no time to actually promote the games or system, further harming sales. In the end, PlayStation would launch that September, and in the span of 2 days, it managed to sell more units in America than Saturn had done in the months since its launch. And by November, the PS1 had outsold the Saturn by a factor of 3 in the UK, thanks to a mix of a massive marketing campaign, lower price, far greater library closer to its launch window, and how seemingly every game that could have been a killer app for the Saturn ended up getting heavily overshadowed by the PS1's offerings, with home releases of games like Daytona USA and Virtua Fighter getting massively overshadowed by Ridge Racer and Tekken. So overall, Sega lost their market dominance internationally, customer loyalty, and trust with developers, publishers, and retailers, all because of their neurotic fears of the PlayStation, with those heavy losses being key contributing factors as to why the Dreamcast was stuck fighting an uphill battle that it eventually lost, and in turn led to Sega's current position as a third-party publisher. Whilst that may sound bad, at least Sega still exists in that form today. That's not something I can say about the other 2 companies I'll be discussing. Now, Sega is a company that can often fumble, but things do tend to work out for them in the end. Atari, meanwhile, is a company that had one success in the 70s and then proceeded to make the wrong choice every single time for the rest of their existence. To be honest, I could have put anything they released after the 2600 on here, whether that be the 5200 failing due to not being able to play 2600 games, despite Atari continuing to support the older system over it, or the 7800 where infighting over who should get paid and who would be paying for the system's creation led to it getting delayed for multiple several years, which then created the perfect window for the NES to take the entire American gaming landscape for itself with next to no competition. But I decided to focus on what is easily their biggest failure, the Atari Jaguar. For this story, we need to go back to 1989, where after Atari lost a lot of their early power to both Nintendo and Sega, they came up with a strategy that could help them with the upcoming arrival of the 16-bit era of consoles. Namely, they would work with a company called Flare Technology to develop two consoles at the same time, with a 32-bit system called the Atari Panther and a 64-bit system called the Atari Jaguar. The plan being they would release the Panther to upstage the SNES and Mega Drive, and then by the time the competitors had caught up to their 32-bit hardware, they'd upstage them again by dropping the Jaguar. Say what you will about this strategy to take down their competition, but of all the plans, it was certainly one of them. It was also one Atari wouldn't stick with, as the Panther ended up getting cancelled due to a mix of both it constantly facing technical issues, whilst the Jaguar was progressing ahead of its schedule, meaning if the plan didn't change, the two systems would release too close to each other and end up cannibalizing each other's sales. While this meant that the Panther would never see the light of day, it also meant that now not only could Atari and Flare focus all their energy into just the Jaguar, but by their own estimate, it should have released in 1993, a whole year before Sega and Sony's 32-bit offerings and 3 years before the Nintendo 64, giving them more than enough time to flex the Jaguar's power. When the time came to actually manufacture the console for mass production, Atari made a deal with the computer tech company IBM, promoting the system as one made in America. Even though Flare, the company who actually designed the system and made some of the custom parts for it, were based in the UK. Anyway, after all the finer details were sorted, the system had a soft launch in 1993, within the test markets of New York City and San Francisco, with them shipping out 17,000 units for it. However, it's at this point where we have the major inciting incident with the system's launch, as thanks to a mix of a short supply of the necessary parts to make the Jaguar, and the fact that IBM, owing to their history as a computer company, had never manufactured a games console before, there was a massive shortage with not enough stock to go around, especially not for a worldwide release, with the Jaguar not seeing a proper launch until 6 months later in mid-1994, with Atari choosing to send most of their units to America instead of Europe. This not only meant that certain countries got next to no stock, the most egregious being the UK only getting 2,000 units on launch day, despite being home to one of the largest video game markets in Europe and being an area Atari had seen a lot of success in with systems like the Atari ST, but that 6-month window also allowed people to discover something Atari had been hiding from them, the fact that the Jaguar was not a 64-bit system. Instead, it featured two 32-bit processors that worked in tandem, which not only led to games that weren't really doing anything the later released Sega Saturn or PlayStation couldn't do, but the gaming magazine Electronic Gaming Monthly infamously pointing out that by Atari's own logic, the Saturn was a 112-bit console. But it turns out that actually trying to utilize this technology was so complicated to most developers that the few who stuck with the system mostly decided to just port 16-bit games, meaning that even if the Jaguar was capable of higher-end stuff, nobody bothered to put in the effort to try and find out what they could do with it. Combine both of these factors, and the system was left with next to no worthwhile releases, only having 3 games available for its 93 test launch, 5 by the time it released internationally, and 50 by the time it was discontinued in 1996, with an additional 13 for a CD add-on that did absolutely nothing to help. In the end, the Jaguar only sold around 125,000 units, with its failure often being directly cited as the main reason why the company would eventually quit the console industry altogether, eventually merging with JT Storage, a hard drive manufacturer, before getting bought by the video game division of Hasbro, who in turn were later sold to Infogrames, who then renamed themselves to Atari. So whilst they technically still exist. It's pretty much in name only, with the company having been effectively put to rest decades ago, making for a kind of fitting tragedy of how the system that was supposed to show how powerful Atari were instead was the perfect showcase for how far they had fallen since their first success. We'll end things off today with a system that didn't fail due to any kind of marketing or stock supply issues, but instead simply comes down to the fact that the idea behind the console itself was just really bad from almost every conceivable angle. That system being the Commodore 64 game system, or the C64GS for short. To give the full context of why this thing was such a terrible idea, let's quickly set the scene for when it was released. The year is 1990, and Commodore International is struggling. What was once a powerhouse within the video game scene during the 70s and 80s, with systems like the VIC-20, the Amiga line of computers, and most famously the Commodore 64, was now losing footing in the PC market to IBM and Apple, with the majority of the video game market looking towards the 16-bit offerings of the Super Nintendo and Sega's Mega Drive. So in a desperate attempt to combat this, Commodore decided to try and throw their hat into the ring, but in what was likely an effort to save money, instead of creating a wholly new console from scratch, they instead just took a Commodore 64, removed the keyboard and the ability to play games via cassette tape, and sold it at a reduced price of £99, compared to the regular C64's £159. If you haven't caught on to how this was destined for failure, here's a quick breakdown of everything wrong with that plan. 1. The C64 was 8 years old by this point, so a machine built with the same tech as an almost decade-old 8-bit computer was never going to stand a chance when put next to Nintendo and Sega's 16-bit offerings. 2. Despite the fact the system could theoretically play most C64 games that released on the cartridge format, thanks to removing the keyboard, this meant you were limited to games that were either playable without it, or were made with the C64GS in mind, raising the question of why would you ever buy this thing over a regular C64 which doesn't have this problem and can play the C64GS games. 3. By making it only compatible with cartridges, it meant the C64GS would actually be more expensive in the long run, as owing to the fact that games made on tape were easier and cheaper to produce, they could be bought at a fraction of the cost as their cartridge counterparts, meaning that despite being the more expensive system, getting a regular C64 was arguably the better option economically. And 4. Given the C64 was already a relatively cheap option by this point in time, and how much you were losing from buying a GS, the £60 price cut wasn't really worth it in the end. Despite these red flags, the system would be released in 1990, with it primarily being sold in the two markets Commodore was the most popular in at the time, those being the UK and Germany. 20,000 units were made and shipped, but despite promises of over 100 games before the end of the year, across its lifespan, only 28 were officially made for it, most of which were just compilations and re-releases of games you could already get for the regular C64. And if you want an idea of how half-assed the support was, one of the big killer apps for the system was a game based on the then newly released Terminator 2, which despite being made with the C64GS in mind, was rendered unplayable on the system due to the fact you needed to use the keyboard to get past the title screen. In the end, out of those 20,000 shipped units, Commodore only managed to sell 2,000 of them, making the C64GS one of the worst selling consoles of all time, with the unsold units later being recalled and converted back into regular C64s, the whole thing being an unmitigated disaster. By the way, if you're wondering if Commodore learned anything from this, they basically ended up doing the exact same thing a few years later in 1993, with the release of the Amiga CD32, which was basically just a keyboardless version of the Amiga 1200 with a disk drive. It lasted less than a year, and shortly after, Commodore International filed for bankruptcy, bringing about the death of the company responsible for the world's best-selling home computer. I think that's a fitting enough ending for now, but there's plenty more failed consoles we can take a look at, so if there's any interest in a follow-up, shout out in the comments below if there's any other trainwreck releases that are worth taking a look at. But just remember, if you ever feel like you're struggling with thoughts that whatever you're working on isn't good enough, remember that everyone makes mistakes every now and again. And at least whatever you're working on likely won't lose you millions of dollars and sink an entire company.